I was 20 years old when my father sat me down in our cramped living room, his face set in that familiar grim expression that always made my stomach churn. My brother, Ethan, was sitting across from me, his legs sprawled out, looking completely at ease like he already knew what was coming. "Listen, Sarah," my father began, rubbing his temple like I was already exhausting him just by existing. "We've made a decision. Ethan's college tuition comes first." I remember sitting there, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "What do you mean?" "I'm already in school, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He sighed, shaking his head like I was a stubborn child, refusing to understand. "We can't afford both of you. Ethan's got a real shot at making something of himself." His eyes flicked to my brother, pride evident, before landing back on me with something colder. "You're smart, Sarah. You can always go back later." Later? That word haunted me for years. Ethan didn't even look at me. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, probably texting his girlfriend, or planning another weekend trip with his friends. He never had to worry about how things would get paid. He knew someone would always take care of it. And that someone was me. The argument that followed was a blur of hurt and frustration. I reminded them that I had a full scholarship, that I was working part-time to cover what little I needed. But my father didn't care. He said the scholarship wasn't enough, that tuition was just the beginning, and that Ethan deserved the best. I looked at my mom for support, but she just wrung her hands and gave me a weak smile. "Sweetheart, sometimes sacrifices have to be made for family," she murmured, and I knew in that moment she wouldn't stand up for me. In the end, I dropped out. I packed up my dorm, handed in my resignation at the bookstore where I worked, and came home to a life I didn't want. The bitterness I felt when Ethan got his shiny new laptop and moved into his expensive dorm never fully left me. He didn't even say thank you. He just expected it. And my father, he acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I should be proud to be of service to the family's golden child. I worked hard. I took 2 jobs, one at a local diner where I endured long shifts on my feet, and another as a receptionist at a dental office. My life became a cycle of work, sleep, and scraping together what little I could to contribute to the household, while Ethan coasted through college without a care in the world. Years passed, and I barely saw him, except during holidays when he'd come home with his friends, laughing and bragging about his life, while I served them snacks and refilled their drinks. My father, always beaming with pride, would introduce him to anyone who'd listen. "My son, Ethan, is studying finance at one of the best schools in the state." And then there was me, Sarah, who stayed behind. Sarah, who was always helping out and making sure the family stayed afloat. Sarah, the afterthought. I resented every second of it, but I never let it show. Instead, I saved. Every spare dollar I made went into a hidden account. I stopped waiting for my turn to go back to school and started planning a life without my family weighing me down. Eventually, I found my way out. I got a job at a logistics firm, climbed the ranks, and moved into my own small apartment. I was no millionaire, but I was self-sufficient. And most importantly, I was free. Or at least, I thought I was. Because now, years later, my father's voice was on the phone again, asking for another sacrifice. But this time, I wasn't that naive girl sitting on the couch, clutching my dreams with trembling hands. This time, I was ready. I was halfway through my lunch break, savoring the rare quiet moment in my office, when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, Dad. A part of me considered letting it go to voicemail, but I knew better. Ignoring him only led to more calls, more messages, and eventually a surprise visit that I didn't have the patience for. With a sigh, I picked up. "Hey, Dad." "Sarah." His voice was brisk, no pleasantries, just straight to business as always. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, bracing myself. "What's up?" "It's Ethan." He said the name like it explained everything, and maybe it did. "He's in trouble." I closed my eyes, already feeling the tension creep up my spine. "What kind of trouble?" Dad exhaled heavily, the sound grating. "Debt, Sarah. A lot of it. He's been struggling to keep up with his student loans, credit cards, and a few other things. I almost laughed. Struggling? Ethan, who had never struggled a day in his life? The same Ethan who, last I heard, had taken a trip to Europe with his friends. Let me guess, I said coolly. He maxed out his credit cards on vacations and designer clothes? Sarah, Dad snapped, the irritation in his voice familiar, like I was the one being unreasonable. This isn't the time for judgment. Your brother needs help, and I told him we'd figure something out. I could practically hear the unspoken words, and by we, I mean you. I bit my lip, a bitter taste filling my mouth. And why exactly is this my problem? Because we're family, he said, as if that alone was reason enough to drop everything and fix the mess Ethan had made. You've got a good job now, don't you? You're doing well for yourself. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound. Wow, Dad. I guess all those years of me working my ass off while Ethan partied finally paid off, huh? Sarah, don't be like this, he said, his voice dropping into that disappointed tone he always used when I didn't fall in line. You know we've always done what's best for the family. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. No, Dad, you did what was best for Ethan. You made me drop out so he could go to college, remember? You told me I'd get my chance later. But later never came, did it? There was a pause, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally admit he was wrong. But of course he didn't. You're being selfish, Sarah, he said, his voice sharp. After everything we've done for you? I cut him off. Done for me? The words burned in my throat. Dad, you forced me to put my life on hold for him. I lost years working dead-end jobs just to help pay for his future, and now you want me to clean up his mess again? There was another long silence before he spoke again, quieter but still firm. I'm asking you to step up. Ethan's your brother. I felt the anger bubbling inside me, the years of pent-up frustration clawing its way to the surface. And then, with a deep breath, I let it out. No, Dad, you made your choice then. I'm making mine now. His sharp intake of breath told me he wasn't expecting that. So, that's it? You're just going to turn your back on us? No, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm just done being the backup plan. I hung up before he could say another word, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line, and I wasn't about to cross it again. The calls started the next day. First, it was my father, his voice heavy with barely concealed frustration. Then my mother, her tone softer but laced with guilt-tripping undertones. Finally, Ethan himself, texting me as if nothing had happened. Hey, sis, Dad said you're being a little dramatic. Let's talk? Dramatic. That word made me see red. I ignored the messages, silenced the calls, and focused on my work. But the quiet didn't last long. That weekend, my father showed up at my apartment. He knocked twice hard, the way he always did when he meant business. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but I knew better. Sighing, I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression a mix of annoyance and that same expectation he'd always carried when it came to me. You didn't answer my calls, he said, stepping inside without an invitation. Busy, I replied flatly, crossing my arms. What do you want, Dad? He sighed, rubbing his temples like he was the victim here. Sarah, you're not being reasonable. Ethan is drowning in debt. He's struggling, and as his sister, you should be willing to help. I stared at him, incredulous. Willing to help? Like I haven't been doing that my entire life? Do you know how much I gave up for him? Do you even care? His eyes narrowed. We did what was best for everyone. No, Dad, you did what was best for Ethan, and now you're back, expecting me to fix things again. I shook my head. Not this time. Dad's jaw tightened. You're being selfish, Sarah. This family has always been about sacrifices. I laughed bitterly. Funny how I'm the only one who ever had to make them. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a warning tone. Ethan is your brother. Family comes first, always. I met his gaze without flinching. Not when family means losing myself, Dad. You made me sacrifice my future for him once. I won't do it again." He left without another word, but I knew it wasn't over. A few days later, Mom called me at work, catching me off guard. I answered out of habit, and the moment I heard her voice, I regretted it. "Sarah, sweetheart," she said, in that pleading tone that used to work on me when I was younger. "We're worried about you." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy." "It's not just about you," she continued, undeterred. "Ethan's struggling, and your father is stressed beyond belief. We're all trying to figure this out together, honey." I felt a pang of guilt, but I shoved it down. "Mom, Ethan is a grown man. He made his choices. Why does it always fall on me to clean up his mess?" She hesitated, and I could almost hear her weighing her words. "Because you're strong, Sarah. You always have been. Your brother, he's not like you." I clenched my jaw. "You mean he's irresponsible and entitled?" "Don't say that," she chided gently. "He's just had different opportunities." Opportunities I never had. "I'm not doing this, Mom," I said firmly. "I have my own life now." There was a long silence before she sighed. "I just thought you'd understand. We're family." Family. That word again. I hung up before she could say more. But they didn't stop. Dad started sending me guilt-ridden emails, detailing how much pressure he was under and how the family was falling apart. Ethan left voicemails sounding casual, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Sarah, I know things got tense, but come on, you know I'd do the same for you." The audacity made my blood boil. He wouldn't have lifted a finger for me. I thought I was done, but then came the breaking point. A message from Ethan's bank forwarded to me by my father. Notice of delinquency, immediate payment required. They had actually given my email as a backup contact. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling with fury. They had assumed I would step in, that I'd see the debt and immediately cave like I always had, that I'd pick up the pieces just like before. But not this time. I sat down that night and started digging. If they wanted to drag me into this, I'd do it on my terms. It didn't take long to find out that Ethan's debt wasn't just student loans and basic living expenses. It was reckless spending on luxury items, unnecessary gadgets, and expensive trips he had no business affording. Credit card statements showed restaurant tabs that equaled my monthly rent, designer clothes, gadgets, and payments to luxury resorts. He wasn't struggling, he was indulging. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to face him. I showed up at my parents' house unannounced, stepping through the front door and finding Ethan sprawled on the couch, his laptop open, and a half-empty soda beside him. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Sarah?" I held up the printed bank statements. "Care to explain this?" His face paled, and he tried to wave it off. "It's not as bad as it looks." "Not as bad?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been living like a king while I spent years breaking my back to make ends meet, and now you want me to bail you out?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I made some bad choices, okay? But Dad said—" "I don't care what Dad said," I interrupted, stepping closer. "You're on your own, Ethan. I'm not cleaning up your mess this time." His mouth opened and closed, searching for an argument, but he had none. Instead, he muttered, "I thought you'd be there for me." I laughed coldly. "Like you were there for me when I dropped out, when I worked 2 jobs to keep the house afloat?" I shook my head. "Grow up, Ethan. Welcome to the real world." I turned to leave, but not before catching my father standing in the hallway, watching silently. "This isn't fair," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I met his gaze, feeling years of resentment bubble to the surface. "No, Dad. What wasn't fair was making me sacrifice my future for him. You made your choice back then. I'm making mine now." And with that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. The day after my confrontation with Ethan, I thought I was done. I had said my piece, walked away, and finally drawn the line that should have been drawn years ago. But deep down, I knew my father wouldn't let it go. He never did. Sure enough, that evening, he showed up at my apartment. I heard the knock and sighed, already bracing myself for the inevitable. I opened the door to find him standing there, hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer this time. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms. "There's nothing left to say, Dad." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning my small but tidy living room. "You've done well for yourself," he admitted grudgingly, as if it pained him to say it. "But your brother, he's drowning." I clenched my jaw. "I know. And whose fault is that?" Dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I know we've made mistakes." I laughed, the bitterness bubbling up. "Mistakes? Dad, you didn't just make mistakes. You made a choice. You chose Ethan over and over again. And now you expect me to clean up the mess you made? No." He looked at me, eyes narrowing. "You think you're so much better than us now, don't you? Just because you've got your fancy job and your own place. But family sticks together, Sarah, and you're turning your back on us." My blood boiled at his words. Turning my back? Dad, I was always there. I worked 2 jobs while Ethan partied. I watched my dreams slip away while you handed him everything on a silver platter. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking with the effort to stay calm. No more. Dad's face darkened. "Ethan's your brother. He needs you." I met his gaze without flinching. And where was he when I needed him? Silence stretched between us. I could see the conflict in his eyes, but I knew my father too well. He'd never admit he was wrong. Finally, he sighed and pulled something from his pocket, an envelope. He held it out to me. "This is what's left of our savings. It's not much, but I need you to take care of the rest." I stared at the envelope, feeling a wave of disbelief wash over me. "You're still trying to fix this with my money?" His jaw clenched. "I'm trying to fix our family." I shook my head, my voice calm but firm. "No, Dad. What you're trying to do is fix Ethan's mess the same way you always have by sacrificing me. But I'm not your backup plan anymore." I walked to my small dining table and grabbed the neatly printed stack of papers I had prepared. I turned and handed them to him. "Here. This is Ethan's full debt report. I spoke to a financial advisor at work, and they outlined some options: debt consolidation, restructuring, even bankruptcy if it comes to that." He looked at the papers like they were poison. "Sarah, I cut him off. "No, Dad. If Ethan wants to fix this, he can. But he's going to do it himself. I'm not paying for his mistakes." He flipped through the pages, the numbers staring back at him. "This is a lot." His voice was hollow. I crossed my arms. "Yeah, and not a penny of it is my responsibility." For the first time, I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe even shame. He sighed heavily, and finally met my gaze. "You really won't help?" I stood taller. "I am helping. I'm showing you the reality of what you've let happen. Whether you deal with it is up to you." There was a long pause, and then he shoved the papers into his pocket and nodded stiffly. "Fine." As he walked to the door, he hesitated. "You know, your mother just wants us to be a family again." I swallowed hard but stood my ground. "Then maybe it's time you started treating me like part of it." He left without another word, and as I closed the door behind him, I felt a weight lift off my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I owed them anything. The next morning, I got a text from Ethan. "Guess I'll figure it out on my own then. Thanks for nothing." I stared at it for a moment before deleting it without a second thought. And just like that, I was free. The days following my father's visit were eerily quiet. No more phone calls, no more guilt-tripping texts. I half expected my mother to show up at my door with tears in her eyes, but she didn't. It was as if they had finally accepted my answer, or maybe they were just regrouping, figuring out their next move. Either way, I wasn't holding my breath. At first, the silence felt unnatural, like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but then something strange happened. I started to breathe easier. I found myself enjoying my mornings without the constant tension of waiting for my father's demands. I focused on my work without distractions, and for the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wondering when I'd be dragged back into their chaos. One evening, as I sat curled up on my couch with a glass of wine and a good book, my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, half expecting it to be Ethan with another snide remark, but it wasn't. It was my mom. "I hope you're doing well, sweetheart. We miss you." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of me wanted to respond, to reach out and assure her that I still loved her despite everything, but another part of me knew this was another attempt to pull me back in. I sighed, setting the phone aside. I wasn't ready to go down that road again, at least not yet. A week later, I ran into an old friend from high school while grabbing coffee. Laura and I had been close once, but life had taken us in different directions. She took one look at me and grinned. "Wow, Sarah, you look different, happier." I blinked, surprised. "Really?" "Yeah," she nodded. "You used to have this weight on your shoulders, you know? But now, you seem lighter." I smiled, feeling something inside me click into place. Maybe I was lighter. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself searching Ethan's social media. What I saw made me shake my head in disbelief. He was still posting pictures at fancy restaurants, still flashing his expensive lifestyle like nothing had changed. It didn't surprise me. He'd always found a way to skate through life, charming his way out of trouble. But this time, I wasn't part of his safety net. A week after that, I got another message from my mom. "Your father is having a hard time. He's realizing things now." I frowned at the message, staring at it for a long time. Maybe he was realizing things, but it wasn't my responsibility to fix them anymore. I typed out a response. "I hope he figures it out." It was short and to the point, but it was all I had to give. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm I had never known before, one that was mine and mine alone. I signed up for night classes, finally taking the steps toward the education I'd always wanted. I even started dating again, allowing myself to imagine a future without the weight of my family's expectations holding me down. One afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my heart sinking when I heard Ethan's voice on the other end. "Sarah," he said, his tone unusually subdued. I wanted to say thanks." I blinked. "Thanks? For what?" "For not bailing me out," he admitted. It forced me to figure things out. I mean, I'm still working on it, but yeah?" I sat there, stunned into silence. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get. And it wasn't much, but it was something. "You're welcome, Ethan," I said quietly before ending the call. As I set my phone down, I realized something. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had finally stepped out of the shadow of my family's expectations and into a life I had built for myself, and it felt damn good.